Good morning. On this 7th day of June 2022, we look at chapters 28 and 29 of 2nd Chronicles. And just as part of my enjoyment this morning, I walked out and put something in the mailbox, and as I was walking up along here, right in the corner of our yard in the driveway, 3 feet or so from gravel on either sides, and in grass it's about, maybe 3-4 inches tall. There's a little baby fawn laying there. And just, one of the joys to see, the new birth and the nature, and as much as oftentimes I kind of bemoan the deer and the damage they do to some of our trees and stuff, it was, it was kind of nice to see that little baby lying there very innocently. And I know that the fawn is safe. I mean, it doesn't have any scent right now, so, it's safe from predators, and mama's off eating or sleeping or doing something. But anyway, just a nice start to the day. As we start looking at 2 Chronicles 28, it's not such a good start for King Ahaz. He was 20 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 16 years, but it said he did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord as his ancestor David, but he walked in the way of the kings of Israel. The other kingdom of Judah was the faithful ones, and I've said that before, but he walked in the ways of the wicked, and he desecrated the temples. He closed the temples up and, locked the doors on them, and he made so many false idols and statues, and it says that he made his children walk through fire. He was doing and worshiping all of the false gods and worshiping as these other nations did that worship these false gods, totally forgetting, the God of Israel, the God of Jacob and Abraham, and the God of David. And it just, and it says in verse 4, he sacrificed and made offerings on the high places and on the hills and under every green tree. I mean, I think about just in our yard, he'd have been busy for a long time making an offering under every green tree. But, and then the next verse says, the Lord gave him into the hands of this other king of Aram, who defeated him and took captive a great number of people, killed a lot of people as well. And, it's one of these instances of, the Israelites had been slaves in Egypt. And here now this king of Aram, another, nearby country, comes and captures, or, in a battle, captures and takes a bunch of people captive and takes them away to be slaves. And as he's getting near to his home country, it says there was a prophet there named Oded. And this prophet warned this king, don't bring these people into our country and into our lands. Let them go. Their God allowed your army to be victorious because of their misdeeds, not because you're so great, but their Lord is angry at them. And you don't want to bring the wrath of that God into our area. He says, because the Lord, the God of your ancestors, was angry with Judah, he gave them into your hand. And this is, this king of Aram is an Israelite as well. I mean, he knows this same God. And as we go down a little bit further in there, in verse 13, the end of verse 13, it says they acknowledge, for our guilt is great already, and there is a fierce wrath against Israel. They knew that God was angry with them. They knew that their guilt was great already. And how many of us know that same thing, that our guilt is great? I mean, and we are in need of this gracious and loving and forgiving God. But, so it says then that the warriors let all of the captives go, and the booty before the officials and all the assemble. And, there had been quite a few of them mentioned by name here as we've been reading through this chapter. And it says that all of those that were mentioned by name got up, took the captives with the booty, and they brought them to their kindred at Jericho, the city of palm trees, and they returned to Samaria. So they returned the captives to Jericho, not maybe all the way to Jerusalem or where they had captured them. Maybe they had picked them up different places. But they let the captives free rather than keep them as slaves. They followed the words of the prophet Oded and let them go. And so then King Ahaz, this one who just started reigning in Judah, seeks the help of another king, the king of Assyria. And this, I'm not, Tilgath-Pilneser is the king's name. And so Ahaz, the king of Judah, had sought the help of this king of Assyria to go against some other nations. Well, that backfired greatly because the king that he went to get help for warred against him and took captives, and instead of getting help from the person he asked, he found more trouble. And sad to say, that happens in our world today too. Sometimes we think we have somebody that we can count on for help, for consolation, for some encouragement or whatever, and we find out that we were wrong about them. That's sad when that happens, but it does happen. And we need to be aware of that, and we need to watch out for, sometimes we refer to them as snakes in the grass, that they backstab and do things that way to us. Anyway, that truce or that treaty that he made with that king certainly backfired on him. And but even in all of this, rather than turning back to God, seeing the grace and the goodness of God, and realizing that when his ancestors, the kings that were faithful, had better times and were more prosperous, this king Ahaz builds more statues, and he offers more sacrifices to the gods of these other countries that have come against him, thinking and saying, their God must be greater than our God, so I'm going to sacrifice to their God, and hopefully, I'll get some strength and some respect and some power back. And, of course, that backfired too. The more he turned against God, the more God walked away. And, this chapter kind of ends with, it says that he shut up the doors of the Lord's house, made altars at every corner of Jerusalem, and every city and every high place. He made idols to false gods. And then as he died, he was buried, but again, they did not bring him into the tombs of the kings of Israel. And that was evidently, the good kings were buried in the kings of Israel. The evil kings, the kings that didn't follow God, weren't buried there. So they weren't honored. They weren't as honored that way. And it was, not so long ago we read that as one of the kings died, no one had any regrets, and sometimes, that's what happens. Chapter 29 deals with King Hezekiah, who was 25 when he began to reign. He reigned for 29 years, and he did what was right in the sight of the Lord. It says in my Bible, he was faithful to God, and he realized the error of King Ahaz's ways and says, we need to change. We need to go back to God. We need to come back into favor with God. We need to sanctify ourselves. We need to purify ourselves. We need to ask for God's grace and God's forgiveness. We need to clean up the house of the Lord. And so he calls together in the first month of his reign, it says he opens the door of the house of the Lord and repaired them. So the former king had closed it up and abandoned it, and it had been there in disrepair. And you know how any place can deteriorate when it's not cared for and not lived in. And but this king now that comes, and he says we need to get back to God. So he opens the doors and he assembles the priests and the Levites. And there's the Levites, the Levitical descendants, were to be the priests, but not all of the Levites were evidently priests, because in here it talks about the priests and the Levites, and he says, the king says, listen to me, Levites, sanctify yourselves, purify yourselves, and get us back to God. Our ancestors have been unfaithful and done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And so they started working on the temple, the Levites and the priests, and the king says, it is in my heart to get back into the grace of God. Verse 10, now it is in my heart to make a covenant with the Lord, the God of Israel, so that his fierce anger may turn away from us. And, he realized that it was because of the sinfulness of the people that they were not in favor with God anymore, that God had, in some ways abandoned them, let things happen. And but he says, don't be negligent. We need to get the house of the Lord back in order and all of those things. So they started to work, it says, on the first day of the month, and after 8 days they had gotten to the vestibule. So it took them 8 days to do so much cleaning, and then it took another 8 days to finish cleaning the vestibule, the Holy of Holies, the altar, the place of sacrifice. And so it was 16 days, and it doesn't tell us, I don't think it tells us, I don't remember seeing a number of how many people were working in there. But 16 days is a lot of time. A lot can get done in 16 days by a lot of people, but that's how long it took. And then this new king Hezekiah, went in to the temple, and he did not offer the sacrifice, but he was there as the priests and Levites offered the sacrifices to God. Everything had been put back into place, and they brought, and it says that the offering, I think it was in this part as I was reading earlier, that the consecrated, the offerings were so many that the priests themselves couldn't take care of all of the preparations, I'll just put it that way, preparations. And so then some of the Levites were put into helping with that, with getting all of the preparation. But they offered the burnt offerings, they offered drink offerings, and they worshipped God as they had been instructed. And our chapter ends today with Hezekiah and the people rejoiced because of what God had done for the people. And to think about that, we rejoice too. It's just, as I started this today, I rejoiced as I saw that little baby fawn, a sign of new life, a sign of promise, of hope for the future, of nature taking care of itself and all of those things. And so God does the same. God takes care of us, and it's good for us to know these lessons of those that didn't follow God and those that did follow God, and just to remind ourselves that following God is the right thing to do.